This is a review for Unit 10, Population Biology. I will be going through the learning objectives on page 153 if you would like to follow along. And at the end of this video, I have a whole bunch of practice problems that we will go over. Population biology is extremely important for biologists to understand because it allows us to predict whether a population is growing or not. And it also allows us to look at the different patterns of population growth that we might see in wild populations. The first learning objective says distinguish between biotic potential and logistic population growth and recognize graphs of each. So there's two different types of population growth curves that you should know for this exam. Know that when populations initially begin to grow, they tend to experience what's called exponential growth. And the maximum exponential growth a population can experience is called its biotic potential. So if we were to look at the biotic potential of a population, we would see that over time, the population would grow exponentially. We also call an exponential growth curve a J-shaped curve because it has this J shape. So notice that as a population gets larger, the amount of growth is greater, and we start to see this really steep increase eventually. However, do you think a population could continue growing exponentially forever? Well, actually, usually what will happen is eventually some sort of limiting resources will prevent that population from continuing to grow exponentially. Therefore, a population in the long term will experience what we call logistic growth. So initially, the population may grow exponentially. However, the amount of growth will start to decrease, or the rate of growth will start to decrease, and eventually the population size will level off. And this type of growth curve is called a logistic growth curve, and it's an S-shaped curve, as you can see here. So we can see that the logistic growth curve shown on the right here is more realistic of wild populations. Most populations would not be able to continue growing at their biotic potential because some sort of factors in their environment or resources will become limited. Objective 2 says describe the role of limiting factors in establishing the carrying capacity of natural populations. There are many factors that can prevent a population from reaching their biotic potential, and these are called limiting factors. Limiting factors are any type of environmental factor that prevent a population from continuing to grow exponentially. Limiting factors can come in a lot of different forms, including unfavorable weather. For example, having a shorter growing season would not provide enough food for the population to grow exponentially. Lack of resources, including food, water, and shelter, can be limiting factors. Competition for resources, not enough space, predators, disease, and pollution. All of these factors can prevent a population from achieving their biotic potential. When we look at all these limiting factors combined, we call this environmental resistance. So the environmental resistance is what prevents a population from reaching that biotic potential. And if we look at this biotic potential curve here that I showed you before, if we look at how environmental resistance is affecting this population, it will actually put pressure on the population and pressure on their growth. And that would lead to our logistic growth curve that we saw before. Notice that the logistic growth curve grows exponentially, but then it starts to slow down, and eventually it will start to level off. And the location where it levels off is what we call the carrying capacity. You should know the definition for carrying capacity. It is the maximum number of individuals that a particular habitat can support, or in other words, can sustain. So this is really important. So it's the population size that can be sustained for an extended period of time. So let's look at an example here of how we can actually estimate the carrying capacity. One of the biggest mistakes that students make when estimating the carrying capacity is that they estimate the carrying capacity as the maximum population size. Well, it's not the maximum population size that you observe. It's actually the maximum population size that can be sustained or maintained. So notice here, this is showing the actual population size or growth in a population. This example here, or this graph, is showing type of logistic growth, right? The population is initially growing exponentially and then it levels off. But in reality, it won't just be flat. A population will overshoot the carrying capacity and then go below it, and then overshoot the carrying capacity, go below it, and it kind of fluctuates around the carrying capacity. So if we wanted to estimate the carrying capacity of a population, we want to average all the peaks and the valleys once the population begins to plateau. So for example, here's the peaks, right? Here's the valleys that we're seeing here. And you want to estimate the population size that is between all these peaks and valleys. So if we were to estimate the carrying capacity, we would probably estimate it as approximately, maybe if we look right here, it's about 1.55 million individuals would be the carrying capacity for this population. Notice that initially the population overshoots the carrying capacity, but the environmental resistance brings that population back down, and then it might even go below carrying capacity, in which it would then start to increase again. So it fluctuates here. So make sure that you're capable of estimating carrying capacity, and do not get confused and think that carrying capacity is the maximum size of a population. It is not. It's the maximum size that can be sustained for a long period of time. Objective 3 says recognize 3 types of survivorship and identify organisms that typify each. So this graph here shows the 3 different types of survivorship curves that we might see in wild populations. What determines the type of survivorship curve a population exhibits depends on the lifestyle of that species. And we will talk about that a little bit and review that a little bit more in a second. So let's first talk about these survivorship curves. Notice that when you're drawing a survivorship curve, age goes on the x-axis, or sometimes this might say time down here. And then on your y-axis, you have survivorship. So this is the number of individuals that survive each age. Notice that with our type 1 survivorship curve, so follow this curve, you see that survivorship is really high when individuals are young. It's not until individuals are old that survivorship starts to decrease. So we call this a type 1 survivorship curve. There's a high survival of young, and most individuals survive to an older age. If we look at a type 2 survivorship curve, it's a straight line. And what this straight line represents here is that there's a constant rate of mortality, or a constant rate of survivorship at all ages. So what this means is that survivorship is independent of age. So when you're young, you have just an equal amount of a chance of surviving as when you're older. Okay, so there's no relationship between age and survivorship in this case. Okay, so it's a constant decline over time. Whereas a type 3 survivorship curve, if you look here, notice that right away survivorship drops really quickly. So very few individuals will actually survive to an older lifespan. So a type 3 survivorship curve means that there's a lower survival rate or survivorship in young organisms. This is typical of populations when there's many babies or many offspring born, but very few of them actually will mature. So let's next talk about examples of the type of organisms that would have each one of these survivorship curves. So a type 1 survivorship curve, remember, this is when most of the young will survive, and they'll survive to a more mature age. This tends to be exhibited in organisms that have 2 characteristics. They display parental care, so the parents devote a lot of energy to their young. And so this tends to occur in populations where they have very few offspring. So since they have very few offspring, they can devote a lot of energy to making sure that those offspring survive to an older age. This is typical of humans. So humans would show a type 1 survivorship curve. We typically have very few offspring, and we devote a lot of energy to those offspring. You see this also in other mammals, as well as some birds, which display a lot of parental care and have few offspring. A type 2 survivorship curve, this is when there's no relationship between age and survivorship. And again, this is rarely found in nature. So this occurs in certain songbirds. It may also occur in certain species of lizards. So here you can see this skink here, and the survivorship curve for this skink is shown by this middle line, and you can see that that's more of a linear line showing a type 2 survivorship. A type 3 survivorship curve, remember this means that most of the young die, so very few young actually mature. And this is typical in organisms that have many, many young. This is common in organisms that don't show parental care. So most aquatic organisms like fish. So fish will lay many eggs, but very few of those eggs will survive. Weeds or pretty much any type of plant typically will produce a whole bunch of seeds, and very few of those seeds will actually germinate and grow into an adult plant. Insects are another example of type 3 survivorship curves, and frogs as well, or sea turtles. They tend to lay many, many eggs, but do you think a lot of those little tiny turtles will actually grow up to be adults? Most of them will actually probably be fed upon by predators. Objective 5 says describe the elements of a life table, including survivorship fecundity and age-specific fecundity. And then Objective 6 says calculate the net reproductive rate for a population from these life tables. So before we look at life tables, let's first talk about age structures of a population. And then after we talk about age structures, we'll talk about how we can use life tables to predict what the age structure of a population would look like. So we can construct what's called an age structure chart. This displays the relative number of individuals in each age class or reproductive status. So notice when you construct an age structure chart, the younger individuals are on the bottom of the chart always, and the older individuals are near the top of the chart. So on the left here, this age structure chart is displayed by looking at the different age classes, whereas on the right, we're looking at the reproductive status of individuals in the population. If we're calling an individual pre-reproductive, that means they have not yet reached sexual maturity. So here in the right population, you can see there's more pre-reproductive individuals. If we look at the number of reproductive individuals, it gets a little bit less, and these are the individuals that are sexually mature. And then post-reproductive individuals are individuals that can no longer reproduce, so the elderly individuals in a population. These age structure charts are important because the shape of the age structure chart can tell you if a population is declining, growing, or stable. So for example, if we look over here on the left, we can see that from this age structure chart, there's a lot more older individuals than there are younger individuals. So this is an upside down pyramid here, and this means a population is declining. There's many older individuals, but there's very few young individuals being born into this population. So this would be an aging population. If you look at the middle diagram that looks like a pyramid, you can see that there's a lot of young individuals. So this would be typical of a population that's growing. So there's many newborns in this population. If the number of individuals in each age class of the population is relatively constant, as you see here on the rightmost image, that would indicate a population that is relatively stable. So there's a relatively equal number of individuals in each age class. All right, so just by looking at these age structures, we can tell if a population is growing, declining, or stable. Another way that you can predict whether a population is growing or not is using a life table. A life table contains a list of survivorship, represented by L, and fecundity, represented by B, by age class. And it also allows us to calculate a net reproductive rate, and we use this net reproductive rate to tell us if a population is growing, stable, or declining. So here is your typical life table shown in this table below. And remember, L represents the survivorship. So this is telling me the proportion of individuals in that age class that survive to the next age class. So for example, if I look to the 2 to 4 year olds, about 45% of them will survive to the next age class. If I look to the 4 to 5 year olds, only about 14% of them will survive to the next age class. And if I look at the next age class here, you can see that only 6.6% of them will survive to the next, and so forth. All right, so that's what the survivorship is telling us. Fecundity, or represented by the letter B, is telling us the average number of offspring per female in that age class. All right, so in the 2 to 4 year olds, each female would have about 2 young. For the 4 and 5-year-olds, each female has about 1.5 young on average, and so forth. However, notice that, for example, if I were to look at the 2 to 4-year-olds, each female has about 2 young on average, but not all the females survive to the next age class. So if I want to take into consideration the survivorship and the fecundity for that age class, I would multiply L times B, and I would make another column for that. And we call this the age-specific fecundity. This is the contribution that females in that age class makes to the reproduction, the total reproductive rate of that population. So one of the reasons why it's important to calculate this last column is it allows us to predict whether a population is growing or not. And we can predict that by looking at the net reproductive rate in that population. So we can calculate the net reproductive rate, which is represented by the letter R, by just summing this last column here. So if I sum up this last column here, all I have to do is add it. It's that simple, okay? Just multiply each row and then add that last column, and that gives you your R value. So my net reproductive rate for this population is 1.4685. And what this number is telling me is that it's telling me the average number of offspring each female produces in her lifetime. Okay, so in this population, in a female's lifetime, on average, she produces about 1.5 young. Okay, so that's the average amount. And we can use this number to then tell whether a population is growing or not. If R equals 1, the population is stable, because that means each female is just replacing herself. If R is greater than 1, that means the population is growing. So that means a female is not only replacing herself, she's actually adding on more individuals to the population. If R is less than 1, that means in a female's lifetime, she's not even on average replacing herself, so that population would be shrinking over time. We can relate this net reproductive rate, or this R value, to these age structure charts we talked about before. So if the age structure chart looks like this, is the population growing or declining? Well, before we said it would represent a population that's declining. There's not a lot of young being born. So this would be typical of a population that has an R value of less than 1. What about the middle one here? Is this population growing, declining, or stable? Well, we said before that this is a population that's growing. So which R value would correspond to this type of chart? Well, an R value greater than 1. What about this chart over here? We said this is a stable population, so this would be an R value that's equal to 1. All right, so that just shows how you can relate this stuff together. Let's do a practice problem with this. Consider the age-specific fecundities for the following populations, A, B, and C. So in these life tables, you can see that the LB column has already just been given to you. All right, and they didn't show you the L or B columns individually. So here's our age-specific fecundity. We want to know which of these populations could exhibit the age structure diagram shown at the right. So the age structure diagram shown here, this is typical of a population that's declining. So we're looking for a population that has an R value of less than 1. Well, which of these populations have an R value of less than 1? Well, to answer this question, you would have to just add up that LB column. It's that simple, okay? So bring a calculator for this last exam. Just add up this column here, and if I add that up, I get 0.8. I add up this LB column, I get 1. And I add up this column, I get 1.675. So which of these populations is declining? Well, population A. So that would represent this. All right, so I'm going to go through a bunch more practice problems. So if you want more practice, stick with me and we'll just go through a whole bunch of problems. The next problem says the following table shows the estimated population size of leopards in a rural district of Namibia over a 6-year period. Based on these data, which of the following statements is true? So pause the video, read through the choices, and see if you can answer the right question. The correct answer is D. The carrying capacity is around 120. So notice that the population here is fluctuating. It's going up and down. So that means it probably has already reached its carrying capacity. It's just fluctuating around that. It's already plateaued. And if you were to estimate the average of these numbers here, our carrying capacity would be about 120. The next question says the cane toad lays egg masses containing thousands of eggs in the water. To prevent predation, the cane toad lays poisonous eggs next to the developing egg masses. However, a large number of the offspring are still lost. What type of survivorship curve would you see for the cane toad? So remember, there's only 3 types of survivorship curve: type 1, type 2, or type 3. So which one of those survivorship curves would match the cane toad population? Well, here we can see that the cane toad produces a lot of young. Very few of them survive, so that means there's a very low survivorship of the young in this population, so that is typical of a type 3 survivorship curve. If the question is asking you what type of survivorship curve, make sure you won't get credit for drawing the survivorship curve. You must state 1, 2, or 3 for that. In this case, they're asking you to draw it, so here you would want to draw this out. Penguins often stay with the same mate for multiple years. Females lay 1 egg per year, and male penguins huddle together and care for the eggs while females hunt for food. Draw the survivorship curve you would expect to see for this species. So when you're drawing your survivorship curve, make sure that you have time or age could go down here on the x-axis, and then survivorship would go on your y-axis. What type of curve would we have here? Well, they have very few young, and they devote a lot of energy to their young. So most of the young would survive till they're more mature. So we would see a type 1 survivorship curve, which would look like this. High survivorship until they get old, and then it decreases. The size of a grasshopper population is limited by the number of birds in a prairie. A storm kills many of the birds, resulting in exponential growth of the grasshopper population. Which statement is true for this grasshopper population? The correct answer here would be B. The environmental resistance decreased. So by removing the birds, you removed one of the limiting factors, therefore decreasing the amount of environmental resistance on that grasshopper population. Indicate whether each of the following statements applies to exponential growth, logistic growth, or both. Let's go through each one. Population experiences no environmental resistance. Well, that would be an example of exponential growth because there's nothing limiting the population growth. Number 2, this growth takes into account limiting factors such as food and space. Well, if there's limiting factors present, that will cause a population to grow logistically. The population eventually levels off and reaches its carrying capacity. Well, again, that is an example of logistic growth or a characteristic of logistic growth. What type of growth curve would best describe the following population? So what would you say? What type of growth curve would this population be experiencing? Your only options here are exponential growth, really, or logistic growth. Those are the only 2 types of growth we talked about. Well, you can see the numbers are getting really big very quickly, and they just are continuing to increase. So this would be an example of exponential growth. If I graphed that, it would actually look like this. All right, so the population is growing exponentially. How does the rate of increase between generations change as population size increases in an exponential growth curve? So is the rate of increase getting bigger, or is it staying constant, or is it decreasing? The rate of increase is actually remaining constant. And you might be a little confused by that, but just simply you can calculate it. So if you take 6,561 divided by 2,187, you would get 3. So the population has tripled between generations 7 and 8. If you look at that down here too, take 27 divided by 9, and you also get 3. So each time the population is tripling, but because our population size is larger, that's what causes this steep increase. Which of the following light tables would be typical of an organism that provides food for its offspring? So remember, organisms that provide food for their offspring or provide a lot of parental care would be organisms that show a type 1 survivorship curve. So many of the young will survive until they're older. So in order to answer this part 1 of this question, you would need to look at survivorship. Which one of these populations have a high survivorship of the young until they're older? Well, this one, there's very low survivorship of the young. Only 25% of them survive. Here, 100% of them survive, and then 80%, and then it's 50% of this age class, and so forth. And it kind of starts to decrease pretty quickly at the beginning there. It's high just for the first age class. But if we look at this last category, survivorship is really high in this age class. It's high in the next one, high in the next one, and then it doesn't decrease until they start to get older. So I would say the best answer for this question would be answer C, or population C here, because they have a high survivorship until individuals are older. Which of these life tables show a population in decline? Many students would just guess on this, or they'll look at these numbers here and see which one's declining more. But you cannot answer this question unless you calculate the net reproductive rate that we talked about before. So in order to answer this question, you would have to calculate R for each of these life tables. And not knowing how to calculate that R value is going to cause you to lose a whole lot of points on this exam. So just learn it. It's not that hard to do, and you can guarantee yourself these points. All right, so in order to calculate the net reproductive rate for this population, all I do is I take, remember, the L times the B column, and then I just add up that last column. So 0.25 times 0 is 0. 0.2 times 0.25 is 0.05. 0.19 times 1.5 is 0.285, and so forth. And you want to show all your work, make sure that you get full credit for these problems. When I add up all of those numbers, I get 1.01. Do the same thing for population B. Then I add up the LB column and I get 0.845. And population C, I get 1.1225. And it says which of these populations is declining? Well, that would be population B, because R is less than 1. All right, so that's all you got to do to solve those problems. The following graph shows population size over a 10-year period for leopards. So it says at which point A, B, C, or D does the leopard population have a net reproductive rate greater than 1? Let's look here. What does a net reproductive rate greater than 1 mean? Well, it means the population is growing. So at A, is the population growing? It looks like it's growing to me. So, right away, the answer is A. But let's just double check. At point B, the population is declining, so it couldn't be that. At point C, the population is starting to decline, so it wouldn't be that. And at point D, the population is also declining, so A is the best answer there. What is the maximum number of leopards this environment can sustain? So answer that question real quick. Hopefully you did not say 600, because remember that this is saying sustain. We cannot sustain a population of 600. Every time it reaches 600, it starts to go down. Remember, you want to calculate the carrying capacity here, and that's the average between all those peaks and valleys. So it is about 500. Which of the following could be the R value of a population at carrying capacity? Remember, a population at carrying capacity is when the population is relatively stable. So the best answer here would be B. Kyle is studying a population of the duck-billed platypus. His data are summarized in the following table. What is the net reproductive rate of this population? All right, so you know how to do this, so go ahead and calculate that. So the way you calculate it is you just take the L times the B column, L times B, and you would get a number for each row, and then you just add up those numbers, and that gives you the net reproductive rate. You're not averaging anything, you're not doing anything like that, you just add them up. That's how easy it is. Which of the following age structures best describes this population? Well, since R is greater than 1, the best answer would be a population that's growing, and that would be A. The following histogram shows the size-frequency distribution for a population of dark-sided salamander in mid-Missouri. Most reproduction in this salamander is done by individuals between 25 and 40 millimeters long. So this is our reproductive class here, between 25 and 40 millimeters long. Is this population of salamander experiencing growth, decline, or is it just holding steady? So this is showing you an age structure diagram, but showing it in a slightly different way. What would you guess for this population? Well, you can see that there's relatively very little young, so this would be the same thing as having an age structure chart that looks like this. So the population is declining. There's a lot of old individuals, but very few young individuals. Most frogs deposit an enormous number of eggs in a foamy mass underwater. These eggs provide a food source for fish and other aquatic animals. When the tadpoles emerge, they're exposed to heavy predation. Fortunately, a few individuals survive to adulthood. What type of survivorship do these frogs exhibit? Correct answer is type 3. The graph shows the population size for a primrose species for 10 years following its introduction to a meadow. During which years is the population growing exponentially? Well, our exponential growth is right here. So that's between 1 and 4 years. What is the approximate carrying capacity of this meadow? Remember, you don't want to choose the maximum. Carrying capacity is the average here. So if we were to kind of estimate the average of these peaks and valleys here, I would say the average is around here. So maybe around 740 to 750 would be correct for that. What type of growth curve is shown over the entire 10-year period? So we're talking about this entire period here. So this whole thing here, what type of growth curve is this? Well, it looks kind of S-shaped, so that would be logistic growth over the entire period. A large city is trying to decide where it should build a large school. A local college student took the latest census data and made the following age structure diagrams. Where would the school be the most needed? The east side, west side, or in the center of the city? Well, which one do you think? The west side is the correct answer. Notice that there's a lot of young individuals here in the west side, so there's going to be a lot of students that are eventually going to be needing to go to school, so that would be the best place. The figure at the right shows population growth for a weed colonizing an old field. Environmental resistance is provided by beetles which chew on the leaves. So here you can see the population growth here, and it levels out because there's a lot of beetles that feed on the leaves of the weeds, preventing them from growing any greater than that. Which of the following graphs best describes what you would expect to see if the leaf-chewing beetles were removed by the application of a pesticide? The figure at the right shows population growth for a weed colonizing an old field. Environmental resistance is provided by beetles which chew on the leaves, so they prevent the weed population from continuing to grow exponentially. Which of the following graphs best illustrates what you would expect to see if the leaf-chewing beetles were removed by the application of a pesticide? So what do you think would happen if the beetles were removed? The correct answer here is this first graph. So if you were to remove the weeds, the population would start to grow exponentially, but it would probably eventually reach a carrying capacity and level off. Whereas the other two graphs don't show this relationship. The third graph shows it increasing exponentially, but it wouldn't continue doing that forever. There would be something in the environment, such as space, that would limit this continued growth of the weeds. The following is a life table for a population of a newly discovered tropical plant. Which age class has the highest age-specific fecundity? So remember, to calculate the age-specific fecundity, you need to calculate the LB column, because LB represents age-specific fecundity. So I take 0.98 multiplied by 0, I would get 0, so forth, and you get that. Which one has the highest age-specific fecundity? Well, our highest age-specific fecundity is 1.125, and that's the 4-year-olds. What type of survivorship curve would best describe this population? Well, if we look at survivorship, it's it's high, right? Until they get to be 4 or 5 years old, that's when it declines. So I would say the best answer here would be a type 1 survivorship curve. Following data show the ages of death in months for all of the individuals in two populations, A and B. So this is showing how old they were in months when they died. Which population, A or B, has a type 3 survivorship curve? So which of these would represent that? That would be population B. Most of the individuals are dying young at 1 or 2 months. Very few of them are living to an older age. All right, that's the end for Unit 10.